Love is at the root of everything. All learning, all parenting, all relationships, love or the lack of it. The greatest thing we can do is to help them know that they are loved and capable of loving. This is a quote from Mr. Rogers. So the other day, Heidi and I, what's great about Christmas break is that, at least for teachers anyways, they get a few days to kind of rest and relax and recharge. And so Heidi and I took one of those evenings and we sat down and we watched Won't You Be My Neighbor? This is the documentary that was released, a couple months back. I don't know exactly when. But it's the story of Mr. Rogers and Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And if you haven't watched it, I would encourage you to take the time to rent it and do so, because it will remind you that there's still good people out here in the world. But what Mr. Rogers does, this is like a minefield up here. I guess I'll just stay right here. What Mr. Rogers does, this is why you're always down there. What Mr. Rogers does is terrifying to like 50% of our population, especially guys, I think. Because what Mr. Rogers does every day is he talks about feelings. And then, even scarier than that, is not only does he talk about feelings, but he tells children that he likes them, that he loves them. He tells adults that he likes them, that he loves them. And he does this for 30 some odd years, like 33 years. It's something around there. And he does this through his television show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And I didn't realize it until I watched this documentary, but he actually, he's kind of received some fairly harsh criticism from folks who said that, what's wrong with our kids today was that Mr. Rogers is out there telling them that they're special. And I think that's kind of crazy, because that kind of criticism misses the mark of what Mr. Rogers was really telling them. He wasn't talking about entitlement. He's not talking about the fact that you deserve whatever you want. No. When he's telling a child that he likes them and that they are special, he's saying that you have inherent value. You have worth. And so here's what he says. He says, what that ultimately means, of course, is that you don't ever have to do anything sensational for people to love you. And so we have officially begun the journey into Christmas. And you might have thought the journey of Christmas ended, but it's not. It's still going on. And the danger we have of Christmas is that we sanitize it. We wash it clean, and it becomes about stars and beauty. And there are aspects of that story, of the Christmas story, that are completely beautiful and wonderful. I mean, if you've ever been a parent, and if you have ever held your child in your hand for the first time, that is a beautiful moment. That is a moment that you can't explain. And so for Mary, when she held Jesus for the first time, that would have been a beautiful moment. Joseph's love for Mary and for his adopted son Jesus, that was real. That was beautiful. But it isn't all pretty, the Christmas story, because the world is very much a dangerous and it's a broken place. And there was a man in power, and we heard the readings from the scriptures. A man in power by the name of Herod, a king who did not grow up listening to Mr. Rogers. No, he doesn't know what to do with his emotions, and so he's full of jealousy and fear. And he's so full of jealousy and fear that his only response to anything that might be a threat is to lash out. And so Herod he has reason to be afraid. I mean, he only has power because another oppressive government has given him this power. And so Herod has to keep his people in check, in line for the Romans. And so not only is Herod always afraid of what the Romans may say, he then also has to look out amongst his people for people that are going to cause him to get in trouble. And so fear is just a part of his nature, a part of his character. He is a man driven by it. Verse 3-4 says, when the word of their inquiry, this is talking about the wise men, when the word of their inquiry got to Herod, he was terrified because he realized that there's a threat out there that he can't control. And so the world that Jesus enters into, it's not only this beautiful and wondrous like we celebrate on Christmas, but it's also treacherous. And so it becomes so dangerous that Jesus and his mother Mary and his earthly father, they have to flee for their lives. They become refugees. And specifically, one kind of passage sticks out to me. It says, Joseph obeyed. He got up. He took the child and his mother under the cover of darkness. And earlier we watched two stories. We watched Hiba's story and we watched Ada's story. And both are these refugees who have fled from violence. And as I watched Hiba talk about her experience, she said something that stuck with me. She said, I miss everyone. The one I love most is my brother who died. And I don't like to see bad things. I like to see good things. I mean, that's true for all of us, right? That's Hiba's story. That's our story. And when Ada's story opens, it opens with this question. The question is, why are you crying? And she answers that question by saying, I told her that I was alone with my son and I had nowhere to go. What hurt most was seeing my son crying and hungry. Hiba, Ada, Mary. And when we read these stories in the Bible, we often think, man, this is stuff from a long time ago. This is 2,000 years old, and yet here we are. The same story that Mary is experiencing is being experienced today in the present. I mean, I can't imagine what it would take. I mean, if you thought, what would it take? What would you grab? What would you put on your back? If you had to flee today, what would you carry with you? It's a question we hope that nobody ever has to ask of themselves, and yet this story, Mary's story, it resonates into the present, into now. And it's being lived out across the world. And so we give these folks, these people, a name. We call them refugees. And I wanted to take a moment to think about what that means, because something happens in our consciousness. Something changes in us when we stop using names and start using generalizations to talk about people. It's a process known as dehumanization. You've probably heard the word. You may have used it yourself. And it's the act of removing a name so that a human being with inherent value becomes more like a statistic, a number. And we remove those positive characteristics, the positive characteristics of the person. And when we dehumanize, we allow ourselves to forget. Ada stops being Ada and becomes a refugee, a number. Hiba is just another kid trying to get across a border. Mary stops being Mary and becomes another mom trying to take advantage. Why doesn't she just stay where she belongs? We heard those words before. Jesus stops being Jesus. They're just refugees. When we dehumanize, we allow our fears to speak for us. And what we fear becomes manifest in others. People without names are scary. And some will argue we need to dehumanize. I mean, how else can we make those tough calls, those hard decisions? But this is where Mr. Rogers comes back in. Comes back into our story because he spoke to millions of kids, and never once did he ever need to talk down to them, or did he forget that they have value, that they have worth, that they were special. I mean, I don't even think I can talk about refugees without the song popping into my head. There's a good chance that you know it, right? It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? He sings it way better. So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? I mean, how many folks know or heard that song growing up? Unfortunately, it's like my kids who haven't. Like the rest of us have. He sang this song for 30 years. And this is what he has to say about it. He says, well, I suppose it's an invitation. Won't you be my neighbor? It's an invitation for someone to be close to you. And I think everybody longs to be loved and longs to know that he or she is lovable. And consequently, the greatest thing that we can do is to help somebody know that they're loved and capable of loving. The greatest thing we can do is to help somebody know that they are loved and capable of loving. Do you know what I think the opposite of love is? Sometimes I think we may think hate's the opposite of love. I don't think that's it. I think the opposite of love is fear. Because fear causes us to tighten our fists when we should be opening up. Fear causes us to react instead of to listen. Fear unchecked allows us to forget about the needs of others because we are so focused on the needs of ourselves. Fear makes us more like Herod than it does Joseph or Mary or Jesus. And because when we allow fear to determine how we're going to interact with others, or influence how we're going to perceive others, or determine what our next actions will be, we stop trusting that God is in our midst. We stop trusting that God will be faithful to the promises that He's made us. And I don't want to do Mr. Rogers a disservice because saying fear is bad. Well, fear is an emotion. It's a part of us. And it's one of the reasons we're still alive. Don't go pet that lion. That's a bad idea. But fear unchecked, it can't be how we define how we see others. Fear must be checked by love, and that means being vulnerable. And so there's some really good quotes in this documentary that came out that stood out to me. But one of them was this. He says, "Let's take the gauntlet and make goodness attractive. That's the real job that we have." And he says, I'm not talking about Pollyannish kind of stuff, which that's a word I didn't know. I had to go look that up. But Pollyannish is like when you try and take a spin on something that you try and spin a good thing on something that probably should bring out sadness or discouragement. So he says, I'm not talking Pollyannish kind of stuff. I'm talking about down-to-earth actual goodness. People caring for each other in a myriad of ways. What changes the world? The only thing that ever really changes the world is when somebody gets the idea that love can abound and can be shared. Fear is inward focused. Its purpose is to keep you safe. Therefore, when we live and exist from a state of fear, we are incapable of loving. I lost the microphones I'm looking for. That's all right. But courage. that's going against that fear. That is asking what, in spite of my fear, is the most loving thing I can do. And so if you think back through your life, there's a red and blue microphone somewhere. Is it? Oh, they're on the stands. Okay. So if you think back through your life, one of the things we recognize about who we are and who we've become is that someone has spent energy, has spent time, has spent part of themselves pouring love into you. And one of the things that Mr. Rogers liked to do is he said he would like to take a moment, take some time, and reflect. And to think about, specifically, he'd say, think about, well, he said this: from the time you were very little, you've had people who have smiled you into smiling, who have talked you into talking, sung you into singing, loved you into loving. So I want to invite you to take a moment and think about who those people are. And then I've got this lovely microphone, and then I'm going to try this. Or if I'm on the other side and there's a name that has come to you and you just want to shout it out, feel free to shout it out. But I'm going to give us about 30 seconds of silence. And then if there's a name that you'd like to share, or someone who has smiled you into smiling, someone who knows no matter where you are, deep down, they've wanted what was best for you. They've always cared about you beyond measure and have encouraged you to be true to the best within you. So let's take a moment and think about those people. Does anybody have a name they're willing to share? Maybe this way. Way in the back. Oh, you could have come to me. What name do you have to share?
My best friend Bree.
Her best friend Bree? Okay. Likes to be called Bree. Does anybody else have any names they'd like to share? Your sister Kelly. I think that works better. I'll just re-say it. Your grandma. Mom. Wendy. Yeah. She's sitting right there. That's right. Wendy. We all have names that we carry. And when we fail to recognize that aspect of humanity, we become more like a Herod and less like a Jesus. And so we recognize, I should sit on that. We recognize that people have poured into us so that we, when we're in the right place, can pour into others. And that's just sometimes we're in good places where it's easy for us to pour into others, and sometimes we need people to pour into us. And so here's the thing: Ada's story, Hiba's story, Mary's story. They're our story, and we have a responsibility given to us by the cross to respond. And the even crazier part is that sometimes folks may come from Central America or Syria, but then there'll be some folks who've entered into the doors of East Church, and they're going to need us to respond and to be that light until they can carry on that light. So they're in the place where they can carry on that light and pour into others. So, with that being said, Mr. Rogers has one last word for us, If you didn't see, he did a special right before he died. He did like a little PSA, kind of his goodbye. And so I thought I would offer up Mr. Rogers' goodbye to you today to kind of dwell on and to think about.
Down the street and someone 20 or 30 or 40 years old will come up